All right, everybody, ready to dive deep into something kind of fascinating. Today we're talking about something pretty important to all of us, our brains, and specifically what we eat and how it affects our mood and memory, even the risk of some serious conditions like dementia. Now, to help us break down the science behind all the food choices we make every day, we've got, well, a real expert here.
It's great to be here.
So, you guys sent in a ton of articles on foods that are both good and bad for the brain. And we're going to try to break down some of the highlights, the surprising stuff, and of course, what it all means for you.
Sounds good.
So I'm seeing in this stack here, there's good news. Berries, salmon nuts. Those are all brain-boosting all-stars. But we're going to kind of put those aside for a minute and focus more on the potential pitfalls, those foods that we might be eating every day without realizing that. They could be quietly chipping away at our mental sharpness.
Yeah, it's kind of scary when you think about it.
It is. So where do we want to start?
Well, I think a lot of people already know about trans fats.
Right. Yeah, most of us know trans fats are bad for our hearts. But I think the link to brain health might be a surprise for a lot of people.
Yeah, and that's really what's come out recently. It's not just about clogged arteries. There was a study in neurology that found that high levels of a common trans fat called oleic acid were very closely linked to an increased risk of developing dementia.
Wow. Okay, oleic acid? Where do we find that?
Well, think about all the processed snacks and baked goods. You know, things that use margarine or shortening, like cookies and crackers, and even some frostings.
Right. So it's not just the obvious things like French fries that we need to be careful of,
Yeah.
but also those seemingly harmless snacks that we might reach for without even thinking.
Right.
Wow, this is making me want to read labels more carefully.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so let's talk about sugary drinks. You know, most people, I think, understand that those are loaded with empty calories, but the effects on the brain go way beyond just a sugar rush.
Yeah, you're right. And this is where it gets really interesting and even a little unsettling, I think. Research has shown a link between sugary drinks and the actual shrinking of certain brain areas.
Really?
It's true. And the main culprit seems to be fructose.
Wow.
And we're not just talking about soda here, but also sweet tea and fruit juice and basically anything with a lot of added sugar.
That's a pretty sobering thought. It makes you realize how often you reach for a sugary drink without thinking about the potential consequences.
Right.
So I know what some people might be thinking now. If sugar is bad, then diet soda must be better, right?
You would think so, but unfortunately, the research on artificial sweeteners isn't very reassuring. Some studies have suggested that people who drink diet soda daily might be 3 times more likely to have a stroke or develop dementia than those who avoid it.
3 times. Wow, that's a huge difference. Why is that?
Well, scientists are still trying to understand the exact reasons why. But one theory is that artificial sweeteners may disrupt the balance of our gut microbiome, and that can play a surprisingly large role in brain health.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about what we're putting directly into our brains, but also how our dietary choices affect our overall gut health, which then impacts our brains. Wow, it's all genetic.
Yeah.
All right, so let's move on to a category of foods that probably won't surprise anyone. Fried and fatty foods.
Oh.
We're talking about French fries and donuts. Anything that's deep fried and often loaded with saturated fat.
Yeah.
These are the ultimate comfort foods. But it sounds like they might not be so comforting for our brains. What's the science behind that?
Well, when you eat fried and fatty foods, it promotes inflammation throughout the body, and that includes the brain.
Right.
And this inflammation can damage blood vessels in the brain and impair its function over time.
So it's not just about our waistlines, it's about the very structure and function of our brain being compromised by these foods.
Exactly.
So you mentioned donuts earlier.
Yeah.
I'm guessing those are a particularly bad offender.
They are, because they combine the inflammatory effects of the frying with the blood sugar spikes that are caused by refined sugar. And a lot of times they also contain trans fats, so it's like a triple whammy.
Wow. All right, so we've covered the obvious culprits like trans fats and sugary drinks and fried foods. But what about something that's a little less obvious like refined carbs? Those don't seem as dangerous as, say, a pile of French fries.
Yeah, that's the sneaky part about them.
Okay.
Refined carbs like white bread and white rice, they get digested really quickly, and that causes rapid spikes in blood sugar, followed by crashes.
Oh, so that's the culprit behind that mid-afternoon energy slump we all experience sometimes.
Yeah, definitely.
I always thought it was just a need for more coffee.
Well, it could be a combination of things, but those blood sugar swings caused by refined carbs definitely play a big role. And research suggests that this constant roller coaster of blood sugar can increase the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease,
Wow.
especially in people who are already genetically predisposed to it.
So it's not just about feeling foggy or sluggish in the moment, but potentially increasing our risk of serious cognitive decline down the road.
Right.
So what can we do about that?
Well, the good news is that swapping those refined carbs for whole grain options is a pretty easy change that can make a big difference.
Okay. So things like whole grains, bread, brown rice, quinoa, those are the good guys.
Those are the good guys.
Okay, good. Whole grains, check. Now let's talk about red meat. We know it's been linked to heart issues, but what about the brain?
Well, red meat is high in saturated fat, and as we've discussed, that can contribute to inflammation and blood vessel damage, not just in the heart, but in the brain as well.
So steak lovers, take note. Might be time to reconsider those weekly indulgences.
Yeah, maybe switch it up a little. The MIND diet, which is specifically designed to promote brain health, recommends limiting red meat consumption and opting for alternatives like fish, poultry, or beans as your protein sources.
Right. Okay. Speaking of healthier choices, what about dairy? I know for many of us, giving up cheese is a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah.
But what does the research say about dairy and brain health?
Well, full-fat dairy products like butter and cheese are also high in saturated fat, which, as we know, is not great for the brain.
So does that mean we have to bid farewell to our cheese boards and creamy pasta dishes?
Not necessarily. The MIND diet recommends choosing low-fat dairy options.
Okay.
You can still enjoy milk yogurt, even some cottage cheese, without the negative brain health implications.
Okay, so low-fat dairy noted. Now this next one might come as a surprise to some listeners. Fish. Most people think of fish as brain food.
Right.
And rightfully so. But apparently it's not always so simple.
Yeah.
Can you explain that?
Yeah, so certain fish are fantastic brain food, like salmon. It's packed with omega-3 fatty acids, which are essential for brain health.
Right.
But certain types of fish, especially larger ones like swordfish and ahi tuna, can accumulate high levels of mercury.
Mercury. That doesn't sound good. What's the issue there?
Well, mercury is a neurotoxin, which means it can be toxic to the brain, impacting memory and cognitive function.
Oh, wow. So even healthy habits can have a downside if we're not careful.
Right.
It's all about making informed choices.
Exactly.
Okay, so variety is key. Now, I want to touch on something that might seem small, but can actually have a big impact. Hidden sugars. We often hear about the dangers of added sugar, but I think a lot of people don't realize just how pervasive it is in our food supply.
You're right.
It's everywhere.
We tend to think about sugary drinks and desserts, but sugar is hidden in all sorts of seemingly innocent products like salad dressings and marinades, even bread.
Wow. So it's not just about avoiding the obvious sweet treats, but being really vigilant about reading labels,
Yeah.
checking for hidden sugars in everything we buy.
Yes, definitely.
And what's the main culprit?
Usually high fructose corn syrup, the same stuff they put in soda,
Right.
which we talked about earlier, how it can potentially contribute to brain shrinkage.
Oh, right. It all comes full circle.
For those-
So even those small amounts of added sugar in seemingly healthy foods can add up and have a negative impact on our brains.
Yeah, over time, for sure.
Wow.
That's why making a conscious effort to choose whole unprocessed foods and cook more meals at home can make such a big difference in reducing your overall sugar intake.
So instead of reaching for that bottled salad dressing, maybe try whipping up a simple vinaigrette at home
Exactly.
with olive oil, vinegar, and herbs.
Easy, delicious, and much healthier for your brain.
That's a great idea. Well, that's a lot of food for thought, literally. Before we move on to the good news about brain boosting foods, I want to pause for a second and ask you, what stood out to you the most from this discussion so far? What surprised you? What's resonated with you?
What's really struck me is how many of these brain drain foods are just so deeply ingrained in our culture and habits. Like, it's a real wake-up call to examine those everyday choices that we're making without even thinking about it.
Right. It's like death by 1,000 snacks. You might not feel the effects immediately, but over time, those choices really add up.
Exactly, and that's why I think it's so important to shift our perspective and start viewing food not just as something that satisfies our taste buds, but as something that directly impacts the very essence of who we are, our brain power, our memories, our ability to think clearly, and feeling our best.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about how we can actually support our brains through what we eat. We've covered the potential dangers, but what about those foods we mentioned earlier, those brain-boosting all-stars?
Yeah.
What can we add to our plates to give our brains the fuel they need to thrive?
Okay, well, let's start with those vibrant, colorful berries.
Okay.
They're not just delicious, they're packed with antioxidants, especially a type called anthocyanins.
Antioxidants, I remember hearing about those, but Remind me what they do again.
Sure. So think of antioxidants as little warriors, defending your brain cells from damage.
Okay.
They neutralize free radicals,
Yeah.
which are unstable molecules that can cause damage over time, kind of like rust accumulating on a car.
So those berries are like little packets of armor for our brains.
Yeah.
I love that visual. All right, now what about salmon? We hear a lot about omega-3 fatty acids, but what role do they play in brain health?
Well, omega-3s are like the architects and communication experts of the brain world.
Okay.
They help build and maintain the structure of brain cells
Right.
and make sure that messages are transmitted quickly and efficiently.
Okay, so they're building strong, well-connected brains.
Right.
Got it.
Yeah.
What about nuts? I know they're packed with healthy fats and protein, but what makes them stand out as brain food?
Well, nuts are a powerhouse of nutrients, especially vitamin E, which studies have linked to a reduced risk of Alzheimer's disease. And they also provide those brain-building healthy fats, and they can help stabilize blood sugar levels, preventing those energy crashes we talked about earlier.
So incorporating a handful of nuts into our daily routine is a really simple way to give our brains a boost.
Exactly.
Berry salmon nuts. Those are some great additions to our grocery list. But it's not just about what we eat right. What other lifestyle factors play a role in keeping our brains healthy?
Yeah, you're right. Just like our bodies need physical exercise to stay strong and flexible, our brains need mental stimulation to stay sharp and adaptable.
So we're talking about things like crossword puzzles, learning a new language, challenging ourselves with brain games.
Yeah, all those things.
Okay.
Engaging in activities that make us think and learn and problem solve helps us strengthen connections between brain cells and build what's called cognitive reserve.
Cognitive reserve. What does that mean exactly?
Well, it's like building a bigger, more resilient brain.
Oh, okay.
The more cognitive reserve we have, the better equipped our brains are to withstand age-related decline and even resist damage from conditions like Alzheimer's disease.
So it's like having a savings account for our brains, storing up mental strength and flexibility for the future.
I like that.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
Now, I want to touch on something that I think a lot of us struggle with. In our modern, fast-paced lives, stress. We all know it's not good for us. But how does stress actually affect our brains?
Well, chronic stress can have a really detrimental impact on brain health. It triggers the release of hormones like cortisol, which in excessive amounts can actually damage brain cells, impair memory, and even shrink certain brain areas involved in learning and memory.
So stress is literally toxic to our brains.
It can be.
No wonder we feel so foggy-headed and irritable when we're under constant pressure.
Right. It's like having a constant state of emergency in your brain, and that takes a toll over time.
Okay.
That's why it's so essential to find healthy ways to manage stress, whether it's through exercise, or meditation, or spending time in nature, or even just connecting with loved ones.
So taking care of our mental health is just as important as taking care of our physical health when it comes to brain power.
Absolutely.
It's all interconnected.
A healthy mind and a healthy body go hand in hand.
Okay.
And speaking of healthy habits, we can't forget about the importance of sleep.
No sleep. My personal Achilles heel. I know it's important, but I always feel like there's not enough time in the day. What happens to our brains when we don't get enough sleep?
Well, during sleep, our brains are actually hard at work. They're clearing out waste products, consolidating memories, essentially doing a little bit of overnight maintenance.
So it's like our brains are doing a little decluttering and reorganizing while we sleep.
Exactly.
I guess that explains why I feel so mentally scattered when I'm sleep deprived.
Right. When we don't get enough sleep, our brains don't have enough time to complete these really vital tasks. And that can lead to cognitive impairment, mood swings, and an increased risk of health problems down the line.
So how much sleep do we actually need to keep our brains functioning at their best?
Most adults need around 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep per night. And it's not just about the quantity, but the quality of sleep that matters too.
Right. Okay, so establishing a consistent sleep routine, creating a relaxing bedtime ritual, making sure our bedrooms are dark and quiet and cool are all important factors.
Exactly. Making sleep a priority is honestly one of the best investments you can make in your brain health.
It seems like we've covered a lot of ground today exploring both the potential pitfalls and the empowering possibilities when it comes to nourishing our brains.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
It has. It's been a fascinating journey into the world of brain health and nutrition.
It really highlights how intricate the connection is between what we put into our bodies and how our brains function both now and in the years to come.
Absolutely. Before we wrap up, I'd love to hear if you could give our listeners one key piece of advice to start improving their brain health today. what would be that one actionable step they could take?
That's a great question. If I had to choose just one, I'd say start with becoming more mindful of what you drink. Swap out those sugary beverages for water, unsweetened tea, or even a brain-boosting smoothie with berries and a handful of nuts.
Well, that's a good idea.
It's a simple change that can have a ripple effect on your cognitive function, both immediately and in the long run.
That's fantastic advice. It's such a practical starting point, something everyone can implement right away.
Yeah.
So ditch the soda, grab a water bottle, and give your brain the hydration it needs to thrive.
Exactly.
And remember,
it's not about being perfect, it's about making progress. Every step you take toward a brain-healthy lifestyle is a step in the right direction.
I love that. Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to chew on today, both literally and figuratively.
We have.
We've explored the fascinating connection between diet and brain health, debunked some common myths, and provided some practical tips for nurturing our brains to function at their best. And remember, all the reputable sources we referenced in this deep dive are linked in the description below so you can explore them further. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share this information with anyone who might find it helpful. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the world of knowledge.